Well, welcome everyone. My name is Hillary Heath. For those that don't know me, I am the program associate here at the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. I'm calling in from unceded territory of the Anacostan people here in Arlington, Virginia. I would like to turn it over to Nidia Bustillas Rodriguez, who I believe may have dropped off. She was having some serious connectivity issues. Mariana, do you know if Nidia is still with us?
Nidia is just wrote to me by cell phone and she's trying to reconnect. She has some problem. So okay. She will let us know as soon as she reconnects. Nidia, I want to introduce her. She is an indigenous woman from Bolivia, and she's working with Pawanka as a writer, a story writer. And also she's a spiritual leader in her community. So we invite her to this meeting to offer us an opening and a prayer. But it's a pity that she's not able to connect, but as soon as she can, we will turn to her.
Thank you, Mariana. If you could just help me keep an eye out for her and just interrupt me when she joins. In the meantime, I will kind of get us started on the session today. Today's session is part of the CJRF's learning program. It's the last of our three-part series on identity-focused webinars. The first webinar examined gender and climate justice, while the second focused on building and supporting youth movements for climate justice. For today, we're going to turn our attention to the third constituent in the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, which is Indigenous peoples. In this session, we're going to discuss how Indigenous communities are leading the way to a more climate just future, and how philanthropy and the climate movement more broadly can support Indigenous peoples' rights and self-determination. I think I saw Nidia join. Am I correct in saying that? Nidia, it looks like you have no audio.
Yes, it's here, but without the audio. Happy.
Okay. Oh, I think her audio might just be connected.
So, Nidia, maybe you would turn here. Yes. Good.
Yeah, I am going to be very quick. Sorry. I am in Bolivia.
Nidia, Nidia, I think you might need to turn your video off.
But I will do the best.
Nidia, you're coming in a bit choppy. I think it might be better if you turn your video off.
Hello?
Yes, that's much better.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, the connection is very bad, but okay. I am Nidia, and I am a healer from Bolivia, a Quechua woman, and I am working for Pawanka at this moment. And Mariana asked me to support you with a prayer today. We're going to work with water because, like, if we don't have oxygen, we are not going to live. And that is why I have brought today the water, and I am going to do something with you together in order that we can participate. If you have a glass of water with you, please take the glass of water, and we are going to take just one drop, just one drop, and we are going to put this drop in our neck. Please now remember that one drop of water is to have one drop of the ocean with us. We are asking Mother Yemaya, the God of the seas, to bless us. With this blessing, we can start the day. Please don't forget, every day when you are starting your day, you can take just one drop of water and put on your neck, and you are going to remember that you are part of the ocean, that we are part of the world, that we are together, we are not separated. And it is important today to think that we are not separated, that we are one world. We are not in war, we are in peace. We want to change the world, and that is why it is important to think that we are one. Let's ask Yemaya that she helps us, that she helps to recover the unity in our world, in our planet, in the universe, and with us. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing with me this blessing. We may start, sisters and brothers.
Thank you, Nydia.
Mariana, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you, Nydia, for centering us. That was incredibly beautiful, and we appreciate your time and for sticking with us through the connectivity issues, and I'm glad it worked out in the end.
Thank you, and sorry for the connection.
Can't be helped, it's fine. I will move us along now. Before we get into the substance of today's call, I wanted to give a quick rundown of the structure of this session. We're going to be running today as a virtual fishbowl. If you've done a fishbowl in person, you probably know what this means. If you haven't, we're trying to allow more participants to contribute to the conversation than a standard panel allows us to do. In a fishbowl, we have what we've referred to as a speaking circle of 3 to 4 people at a time, and a listening circle that encompasses everyone else. Those in the listening circle should have their videos turned off, while those in the speaking circle should have their videos turned on. You can join the speaking circle at any time by raising your virtual hand on Zoom and by turning on your camera. We do ask that there be no more than 3 to 4 people in the speaking circle at one time, and that if you've been in the speaking circle for a while and others look like they want to join, please step back and allow others to join and have their voice in the space. I'm going to briefly turn it over to my colleague Elise, who will show you how we can execute the fishbowl structure with the Zoom settings. Elise, take it away.
Yes, and can everybody, oh, I thought I was sharing my screen, but Hillary, you have it, so thank you. So on Zoom, you can select the hide non-video participant by clicking on the up arrow next to the video icon on the lower left hand of the screen. This will open a menu, and from there you can click video settings from the menu, and it will open a pop-up box. From there, scroll down and toggle hide non-video participants. See the slide for what this looks like. If everyone has this box checked, we will only be able to see those in the speaking circle and those who have their cameras on.
Thank you, Elise. I'll leave this up for just a couple more seconds as people implement it. Okay. If I could have, well, just one quick note before we start the questions. We realize, as we saw with Nydia, it's not always possible for folks to turn on the videos and have a good connection. If that's the case and you still want to speak, please use the raise hand or chat functions to get our attention, and we'll make sure we get your voice in the room. Let's get started on the questions. For the first question, may I ask Crystal Martin Lipinski, Ole Kanga, and either Jeshua or Lavi from Pecan to turn on their videos while everyone turns theirs off. Everyone else turns theirs off. Okay. Welcome, Crystal, Ole Kanga, and Lavi to the Speaking Circle. For our first question, which my colleague Kelsey will also put in the chat, we're kind of curious how traditional knowledge, practice, and technologies are key to building resilience for Indigenous communities in the face of climate change. Why don't we start with Crystal, and if you could each briefly state your name and organization before you begin to answer the question.
Hillary, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for being here and for inviting us, Hillary. I'm Nivetdak, that's my Inuktitut name. My English Canadian name is Crystal. I am originally from Nunavut, Canada, which is is the newest territory here in Canada, and it's all on Inuit lands. And I am living in unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, which is known as Ontario, specifically the Ottawa area. For the question, it's the way that I explain it is that Inuit have and continue to survive in one of the harshest climates in the world, which is the Arctic region, a climate where our environment is unpredictable to global researchers, to scientists, to policymakers. But to us, we have seen these changes, we have experienced these changes, and we have adapted. Inuit and our ancestors knew how to navigate just by looking at the sky. And there has been a number of Inuit elders and community members to this day who have shared and continue to share that our stars and our moon has shifted. It's gone down and it's not as high as it used to be. And we know when the weather is about to change, just by the texture of the air, how it affects our breathing, what it makes us feel like as we're breathing, and how it touches our skin. We feel the various moistures, the dryness of the air to be able to predict what's happening in our environment. We know when the seasons are about to change, when the animals are migrating, and all of this is Inuit knowledge. All of this is Indigenous knowledge, and it continues to be a way of survival today. In spite of colonialism, in spite of being removed from our traditional territories, our families, our communities, in spite of the pain and hurt inflicted upon us from residential schools and the damage to our traditions, culture, and language. And in spite of all of those worries and uncertainty, we're still here. And we have adapted and we have identified ways of working in a Western system, learning to operate and navigate a very complex system, especially if we're looking at this from an international scope. It's a very complex system. And so what we have done is created strategies and initiatives and projects and programming on our own to ensure that our ways of knowing and being are accounted for and that are being done in a way that works in our communities, that we know works in our communities and our traditional systems. And for time immemorial, Inuit have lived in Arctic regions. It's time that Western institutions begin recognizing that Indigenous knowledge is paramount to climate justice. And that's one of the things that we have really tried to focus on is putting that push and pressing those buttons about the importance of Indigenous knowledge at decision-making tables. Because there's so much exploitation happening in Indigenous communities as it is. And I think, when we're looking at how to improve international relationships, it's about bridging those gaps. It's about Indigenous peoples uniting and having conversations about these impacts and what it's doing and what our communities are doing about it, and collectively working on, collaborating and discussing ways of working against this system and trying to fix it. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. Why don't we move to another Indigenous viewpoint from Kenya, Ole Kanga.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you very much. I think my name is Mali Olekaunga. I'm the Director of Impact in Kenya, working mainly in northern parts of Kenya. But also we coordinate an alliance of a number of our civil society at the grassroots level. Yeah, I think in terms of the Indigenous people's traditional knowledge, they are linked really to, it's very fundamental, the knowledge, the traditional knowledge and practices of the Indigenous, especially the Maasai, whom I've grown. I'm a Maasai, like if you're Maasai, and I've grown there and bred in this area. I've interacted in the bicultural landscapes in which the Maasai occupy quite a number of a considerable proportion of the country. So they have been able to really develop and understand knowledge that is place-based in terms of they can be able to monitor the landscape and also they know, for instance, flowering of certain trees communicates a certain message to them. They know what kind of rain is coming. They also animal behavior, insect behavior. Also, they study the migratory patterns of a certain kind of mammals, wildlife, and also many important. Traditional knowledge is not is differentiated. It's not just that it's a common. Certain traditional knowledge and are unique and are there to specific clans. There are specific clans that communicate to the stars, and they can tell what kind of weather is coming, what kind of they can foresee. We got the diviners, we got the seers who tell and communicate these. They provide us a specific service to the community or community. And what is happening right now, because I've done quite a number of research in terms of Indigenous traditional knowledge and this interpretation of nature and all the climate. They are now, the elders are saying the nature, the trees are no longer talking to us. They don't give that message at the right time as they used to. That for them, that's what they call climate change. And for them also, it is very important the mobility of people and their livestock and animals is what really guides them. They have mastered the landscape to the extent that they are able to say that this is the best time now to migrate to a certain area, lowland or even the highlands. And because, of course, the right to land is very important in this issue. When they lose the land, they lose the traditional knowledge because they have been able to generate this knowledge and they pass it through intergenerational own kind of learning within the family, they transfer. But if they lose the land, because the land is their book. If you lose your book, you can't read. So and that's exactly what it is. The traditional knowledge is place-based, it's a land-based, and it's if they continue losing the land, it is very stressful for them because it is some of these areas or landscapes are transboundary, so they know, and they are also affected in terms of regeneration of the land. they leave one place, go to another one, so that the other part of the land can be able to generate. So in terms of technology, and this has been tested under a number of the Kenya Meteorology Authority has been comparing what the data they collect from their equipment and to that of which the traditional elders and also communities know. And they are more or less similar. The aspect of collecting the information and interpreting it's very different. So understanding that aspect of or appreciating that indigenous traditional is beginning to happen. And we did this recently with a meeting organized by UNESCO, Kenya Meteorology and Impact, where we brought the traditional elders together with meteorologists, and the way they interpret the flowering of the trees, the migratory pattern, and also to feel the dryness or the moisture within the air is more or less what also just basically the soil when and some plants just begin to turn green. They know the rains is there, but also they can tell when the rains have just abated and it's no longer happening. So for us, what is not remaining is actually, while traditional knowledge has been documented fairly, but I think the right to that knowledge is what is actually sometimes a challenge. Kenya right now, Kenya has a law on traditional knowledge and cultural expression, which we came to law in 2016. And this is because indigenous people are pushing that also. There are certain knowledge that are sacred and they don't really want to disclose these. And there are certain knowledge that are considered spiritual and it's only within a certain space. So I think traditional knowledge is a very strong contributor to nature-based solution. But I think for that to happen, I think indigenous peoples need to have guarantee for their land rights, and that twists the whole issue to be more or less a justice issue. It's not just about climate; it's about climate justice. There are rights embedded into territory, and that if they lose those rights, they lose another bundle of rights that are within the communal setup. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ole Kanga. I love this analogy of the land being like your book, and when you lose your book, you can no longer read. That just paints a super vivid picture for all of us. I'll turn it over to Lave.
Thank you so much, Hillary, and good morning to everyone on the call. Happy to be here. For the Pacific, it's quite similar to what my other two colleagues have shared with relation to the Maasai as well as Inuit. The Pacific has, historically been we had our past generations populating the Pacific hundreds of years before Western explorers. And, they navigated the large Pacific Ocean through traditional navigation systems using stars and moon and waves. So being in this space makes us really appreciate traditional knowledge and indigenous wisdom over the years, and which has been, surprisingly been passed through oral traditions, not written as Western science. You have reports, it's been passed through generations to generations through oral history. And just to think about the amount and the richness of those learnings, of those knowledge is, in itself a great feat. And when we sort of look at some of the climate challenges that we're experiencing today, of course, traditional knowledge and indigenous wisdom is really fundamental in the work to not only to fight against and to address climate change, but also to build resilience, to allow communities to mitigate some of the climate impacts, as well as adapting to the climate crisis. Pacific Islanders are very good storytellers. So allow me just to share a snippet of our way of life in Fiji. We've had, so normally when a child is born, after 4 days of woman carrying the child without, the child touching the floor, the family buries, removes the umbilical cord, and the family buries it with a tree for every Itoke or the indigenous people in Fiji. And that is a form of, a sort of underscoring the importance of our connection to the land. We are not, we are part of the land, and we are, an extension of the land. The land doesn't come from us, we come from the land and also for the ocean. And so when we grow up, you always have, a tree, a native fruit tree or a native tree that's growing in your village or your community that signifies, that really, rich and cultural practice. And so we've been connected to the world and I mean to the ocean and to the land, and our community, our value systems is very much based on a communal sense, rather than a very individualistic way that we see now, and have been sort of reinforced by Western influence. And so when we do things, when we navigate the world, it's out of what is in the best interest of the collective good, rather than what's best for me as an individual. And this is something our grandfathers and great-grandfathers have practiced. And so they've always taken, proactive action in terms of the protection of our trees, which now, due to large scale demands for logging, for timber, has led to destruction of our trees. The energy sector, extraction of minerals from deep within our land. And I think that's something our forefathers wouldn't have thought of back then, drilling oil, drilling fossil fuel, extracting coal. And so those are some of the kind of cultural nuances that have guided indigenous and traditional people in the Pacific. And then when we look at climate change, Pacific Islanders have lived with natural environmental impacts for thousands of years and have adapted to these practices to accommodate those periods of environmental fluctuations. And so it didn't take them, to have something like an IPCC report to tell them that the climate was changing. They could sense it. They know it by the winds, the fruiting of trees, and this have subsequently have significantly changed over the years. And so although we've seen the pace of environmental and climatic changes increasing, many communities are leading climate action and combining their own systems of knowledge with Western science to implement locally relevant climate solutions. For instance, we are implementing climate smart agriculture and revitalizing traditional practices that utilize drought tolerant species that benefits nature. They're using seaweed as compost to make the soil more fertile. They're using palm fronds to shade plants during droughts, and planting vegetation to reduce flooding and erosion along coastlines. Communities are revitalizing traditional wells, establishing new protected areas, and also improving the management of existing protected areas. So now we are coming up with marine protected areas in our in our own traditional systems that has been practiced. So normally when our elders sense that we've been overfishing, we place a taboo on a certain area of our oceans or fishing grounds, and no one goes to fish there for, let's say, 3 to 6 months, and that revitalizes that particular fishing ground. So I guess there's a lot that we can draw from indigenous and traditional knowledge, and it just makes us, having this kind of spaces make us appreciate those very valuable learnings and teaching. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I heard what you were saying about the collective, not individualistic actions, and then also being part of the land and an extension of the land. I heard those things also echoed by Crystal and Oleg Hanga. If anyone else would like to enter the speaking circle or participate in the chat, we welcome you to do so now. I think I see someone's hand up. Tanya, would you like to join us? If you'll just turn your video on.
Yeah.
Here you go. Welcome.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I am Tania Pariona from Peru, a Quechua indigenous activist, former congresswoman, member of the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas. Currently, I am president of the Remaining Chicpachani association, which in Spanish means the value of our voices. We work with Pawanka Fund in the empowerment of women through art, culture, and traditional knowledge. About this question, we know that the indigenous people are highly vulnerable to climate change. However, we are the fundamental guardian of the environment. First, traditional practices and technologies are based on the harmonious and spiritual relationship with the land, nature, and cosmos. They are transmitted from generation to generation in community life, collectively and through our native language. In the field of agriculture, indigenous people have developed agricultural techniques that allow them to adapt to diverse ecological levels and varied climates. Seed storage and conservation, crop rotation, natural fertilizers to generate the fertility of the land. Food systems derived from the conservation of biodiversity are key to fight against hunger, malnutrition, and anemia, for example. We have a range of traditional knowledge to regenerate ecosystems, water storage, read the constellation, sun, moon, winds, to see the coming times and those that may be alarmed or treat to planting, harvesting, and welfare of our people. And we need specific programs and projects for mitigation and adaptation to climate change, built from and for indigenous people, but especially women's, indigenous youth. I think this important conversation today, because in my community, for example, water is little, very little. The people now say, I need water for our community, but we need program specific for work about water, for example. That's it. Thank you so much, Hilary. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tanya. This idea of needing programs built by and for Indigenous peoples, I think we'll get back to that in our third question. Do we have any other folks with their hands up or who would like to enter the speaking circle? Maya, please join us. Turn your video on and join us.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So I'm connected on my computer and my phone because my computer doesn't have a video.
Welcome.
So yes, good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here to listen to other Indigenous groups in different parts of the world. It's amazing to see that despite the distance from each other, we share very similar practices. We have similar stories, and we're similar. I've heard earlier in the discussion talks about communal living, but not only communal living, also our respect for the land, our respect for the environment, our spiritual aspects. And it's so similar to us here in Belize when we talk about this question. And I'm very happy to have this space to talk about that, you know, how traditional knowledge, practice, and technology is the key to building resilience for Indigenous communities in the face of climate change. We are resilient people. Climate change is not something that is new. I think that Indigenous communities have had to deal with this for thousands of years. And each time we've been able to adapt, each time we've been able to push through those challenges. And our methods, I mean, everything that I've heard in this from the speakers before, we have proven methods that has worked for us for thousands of years. We're still here. And I believe as Indigenous people, we have the key, we hold the key to solutions to climate change. I heard one of our colleagues before speak about rights to land. In Belize, recently there was a court ruling which acknowledged the rights of the Maya people to land. And right now we're in a very important and a historic event as a people. We are creating legislations on how we go about managing our lands. And it's very important because part of making the legislation, for one, we are actually at the center of it. It is done through consultation. How is it that you are going to manage your resources? What are some of the customary practices? What are the traditional knowledges? And reflecting those in legislation. Those are what we're doing right now here in Belize as a Maya people. Recently, there was the acceptance of an epic document of which we were a big part of creating, which also gave us Indigenous people to right to dissent to projects that do not fall in line with our vision or falls in line with our livelihood. So it's a very we're making progress, and you know, it's just so much to talk about right now. You know, I'm just so, you know, all the information that I've received and everything that I've heard from this session, you know, I'm all over the place. But you know, I do think that we hold the key, as I mentioned, our techniques. We go by the moon, the full moon, the new moon. It's not that you go and cut down trees. It's not that you go and harvest at any time. It's not that you go and plant at different times. Even our techniques here in Belize, we have different areas that we plant. Our staple is corn. So we have an area that's known where we want to plant our matambre, which is during the wet season. We have during the dry season where we go and do our milpa. And these are all techniques that we continue to practice, and there's a reason behind it. We talk about transfer of knowledge from generation to generation. At the center of our traditions, our elders hold a very important position in our communities because they're in possession of traditional knowledge. And so when we go about making decisions collectively, we hear from them too, and they are a big part of those decision making. So that's just what I wanted to share with you all. Thank you.
Thank you for joining and sharing, Maya. Do we have any final thoughts from anyone else in the audience on this question? Oh, Crystal, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Tanya, I hope I said your name right, and Maya's comments. And it really, I think, sums up the fact that Indigenous traditions, regardless of where we are in this world, where we're physically, geographically located, we have common understanding, common respect, and common relationships with our environment and our land and our water. And this has worked for time immemorial for Indigenous peoples. We recognize that, and just based on what I'm hearing from everyone around, regarding gender equality, being inclusive of Indigenous women, being inclusive of Indigenous elders, being inclusive of Indigenous youth, and having our own ways of methods that is nature-based, that is respecting that Mother Earth is a living, breathing person of its own, and that whatever is impacting our environment, may it be perhaps it's trees that are withering, you speak to it, you take care of it, you water it, you're tending to that. And that's the way that Indigenous peoples have always known. And it's that transfer of Indigenous knowledge from one generation to the next. And it's through storytelling. And that's exactly what I'm hearing as well, is that we have storytelling as well. With Inuit, we traditionally didn't have a writing system. Everything was oral. Everything was done by way of storytelling, whether this was sharing stories about the past, sharing stories about survival, and providing, or sharing these stories to children about warnings that they need to look out for. And all of these things, like, we're all interconnected, and what we're really interconnected with is the land and waters in which we live and breathe in. So I just wanted to thank those that shared that.
Thank you, Crystal. I hate to close discussion on this first question because it has been pretty lively, but I think in the interest of time, I will transition us to question 2. Maya made a very good point about Indigenous peoples holding the key to the solutions to solve the climate crisis. And yet a lot of times we're seeing false solutions that are being proposed to address climate change, and that these false solutions could harm Indigenous communities. So would love to talk about what some of these false solutions are and how Indigenous communities are affected by them. And if I could have Crystal rejoin us, as well as Rebecca Sinclair and Roby Halep join us as well in the speaking circle. Welcome. Why don't we start with Rebecca to get a new voice in the room.
Rebecca Sinclair. Mochinida, Barren Lands First Nation, Saskatchewan First Nation. Hello, everybody. I'm Rebecca Sinclair. I'm with Indigenous Climate Action. I am the newly appointed Director of Education and Programming and the former Research and Policy Analyst working on decolonizing climate policy. I am located right now in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, so it's good to be joining you all. In terms of false solutions to address climate change and harm for Indigenous communities, we had recently released a report on the dangers and threats of nature-based solutions. I think this ties in really nicely with the conversation on how traditional knowledge and practices are key to building resilience within our communities as well. The dangers of false solutions really are directed at how our Indigenous folks and communities are left out of the conversation on solutions to begin with. A lot of people had talked about the resilience of our communities. Crystal had a great point on how we've been living in deficits in our communities, and we've had a resilience to that. So, sorry, I don't know if my camera froze. Am I freezing? Am I breaking up? Sorry, and I just wanted to address that kind of situation, because we had seen in the IPCC report and we see in climate plans across Canada that traditional knowledge is going to be a key to this climate crisis. But what does that mean when we're excluded from that conversation? Our communities have an intimate knowledge of the land. We have, and it's not to say that other cultures or whatever don't have a relationship to the land or a respect for the land. It's to say that we've from birth, we have an inherent duty to this land. It's to say that we have a relationship that is translated to us through our language and through that relationship to the land. And it is that intimate knowledge that we can see the changes before they come. We can adapt to those changes before they come. And without us in that conversation, then they're false solutions. Solutions can't be solutions when marginalized communities continue to feel those impacts. So with nature-based solutions, through our conversations and interview process of developing this report, we had great insight from a bunch of different Indigenous folks that had talked really about what does nature-based solutions look like without land back, without Indigenous folks in control of that land that is their traditional territory. How is that going to work? We see nature-based solutions being touted as this next great thing in the climate crisis. However, we don't have Indigenous people at that table with control of things that they know intimately about. And I think that's the key to how we look at false solutions. I often say electric vehicles are a false solution. That's not the reality of our northern communities. That is not the reality of our fly-in communities. And then when we start to see nature-based solutions, we start to see even emission caps. What does that look like in terms of energy sovereignty to our communities? What does that look like to food sovereignty to our communities? And a lot of these nuances or these connections are not being made when solutions are being presented, because we're not part of that conversation. We're not part of that conversation that can relate the realities of our Indigenous communities. So I'll digress there and let some other speak for a bit.
Thank you, Rebecca. This statement you made, that without Indigenous peoples in the conversation around things like the IPCC report, it creates inherently false solutions, is a really good point. Robbie, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, hi everyone. Roby Hali from the Kalanguya and Kankanaey Indigenous Group here in the Philippines. I'm with the Right Energy Partnership Initiative. It's an initiative of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. So I would just want to add on to what Rebecca said on Indigenous peoples not being part of decision making, not being part of the discussions on the solutions for climate change. With the pandemic, we've heard a lot about the recognition that traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples play in reducing or preventing zoonotic diseases and also protecting the environment. But on the other hand, it's still business as usual for government. Solutions that they are coming out with, recovery plans that they are coming out with, is still without Indigenous peoples, and also still continuing to not recognize the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And this is very dangerous, no? For the nature-based solutions, this shift from fossil fuels, without the recognition of the land rights of Indigenous peoples, it's causing displacements, this geothermal energy, these windmills, these projects on hydropower to produce electricity for cities and industries, and not for the communities. No, we've seen a lot of these cases where Indigenous peoples who owns the resources, who hosts these renewable energy projects, often don't have their own electricity, often lose their livelihoods, and they're forced to migrate outside their communities because there's nothing left. No, their agricultural lands are inundated, and their how do you call that, their areas, their sacred areas where they do their rituals and all are gone. So it's also causing the loss of knowledge, important knowledge systems of communities. So we see here what people have been mentioning a while ago on the holistic, the impact to Indigenous peoples. It's not just on livelihood, but more on the identity and the continuity of Indigenous peoples to be able to protect their natural resources and their territories. And another impact, no, of these false solutions is the continuing and increasing human rights violations against Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders. If Indigenous peoples defend their lands, they are being criminalized, harassed, threatened, and worse, many of them are killed, no, because of their defense of their land and territories. And a lot of it's even with the pandemic, no, this did not stop governments and corporations from committing these human rights violations against Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, and with this how they call that, the concept of these nature-based solutions. So governments are discussing on increasing conservation areas, national parks, but again, as Tifa was mentioning a while ago, they don't see it as a living space where people and nature can interact holistically. They see it as a space where plants just plants just grow without human intervention. And here in the Philippines, no, these national parks that have been that are controlled by the government, these conservation areas, a partner NGO that we have here tried to map out Indigenous territories that are controlled, forests that are controlled by Indigenous peoples, and forests that are controlled by the government. It shows that those controlled by the governments are losing out the forest areas, but those controlled by Indigenous peoples are still thriving. So we see here that programs, projects in relation to preserving the forest without Indigenous peoples in the decision making and in the discussion will definitely fail and will cause a lot of human rights violations, displacement of Indigenous peoples, and also the how they call that, the division of or impact to the community cohesion, which we see a lot here in the Philippines when free, prior, and informed consent is being implemented, not in the system, decision-making system of Indigenous peoples. It's causing division to the community, which is irreparable. So the collective way of life is also heavily impacted by all these projects that are being implemented without recognizing and respecting Indigenous people's rights to their own self-determined development. Thank you.
Thank you, Roby. Crystal.
Thank you, Heather. And I'll keep mine fairly quick because I've been sitting here just nodding the entire time, just in full agreement and support with what Rebecca and Robbie have already shared. With Inuit, that's one of the areas that we have really been pushing is the inclusivity at decision making, whether this is nationally or internationally. So just last year in November, the Inuit Circumpolar Council became the first Indigenous organization to be part of the IMO. And so this relates to the impacts of oceans and that sort of thing. And just this week, the Inuvialuit region, which is in Northwest Territories, Canada, have created a management plan for cruise ships so that they can ensure that there's those that, because tourism is a big part as well within our communities, and it does bring in economic growth to some capacity, but I mean certainly not enough. And so this way, the Inuvialuit in Northwest Territories will be able to manage the cruise ships that are coming into their waters and coming into their lands, and doing so that respects their culture, respects the environment. So there's a whole slew of standards that cruise ships will now be required to follow, including employment opportunities for the Inuvialuit beneficiaries in that region. So there has been some changes that we're seeing, but this has come with many hours and years of negotiating these and pushing to be included in decision making. It's not to say that Inuit are, where they need to be. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it has taken 3 generations of literally fighting with our government and with international partners and stakeholders in being part of these conversations. And this has been a collective approach as well between all Inuit in the Arctic region, the Inuit in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka, and working collaboratively with our Sami brothers and sisters as well. And so this, everything that has been mentioned about, what those false solutions are, it's that Indigenous peoples are not being properly involved in decision making. Indigenous peoples should have decision-making powers, should not be just a fly on the wall, so to speak, unless Indigenous peoples have the power to say yes and no to what works for their community and their territorial inherent rights, then they should be sitting at those decision-making tables. So I just wanted to share that and the progress that Inuit have made as it relates to trying to combat some of these areas as it relates to our communities in the Arctic region. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. And for our next question, we'll get to how we can place Indigenous peoples in these decision-making spaces, how to build power within communities. Maya, I see your hand up. Please feel free to turn your video on and join us.
Hi. I really liked, I do agree with the conversation in terms of the conservation and the protected areas as a false solution. Because if you look at Belize, for example, the vast majority of protected areas are within indigenous communities. And there were no consultations held with these communities when they transformed their lands into national parks, protected areas. But it had significant impact on the communities because you can't go and fish, you can't go hunt, you can't go and extract timber for your homes, leaves for your homes. And if you know Indigenous people, we rely on our surroundings. We are one with the earth. We need those. We need to farm. We're subsistence farmers. So when you stop us from entering these lands, you essentially you want us to die, because where do we get our food? Where do we get our source of income? So I think there has to be a clear understanding of there's a reason why these protected areas are still filled with forests. There's biodiversity there, and it's important that they extract information from Indigenous people, from us. How have you been able to keep this land intact? Not just take it away from them without understanding, what and how they go about using it, because there's a reason why it's still intact, because we do not damage our forests. We do so sustainably, as I mentioned before, with our methods. So I think, definitely that the conservation, those are false solutions to climate change, saying, oh, well, you can't do anything within these lands. I mean, these are within indigenous lands. They've been protecting it for decades. There's a reason why it's still protected. But you just further displace them and put them in further poverty. So that's just what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Rebecca, please go ahead.
I just wanted to bring all of this kind of conversation in about false solutions and kind of like this relinquishment of power in colonial systems, and the power imbalance that we've had as Indigenous folks, and the fights that we've had to go through just to be included at those decision-making tables. I think like in a just world that we envision here is not just decision-making powers, but enforcement. In Canada, we have like Indigenous preserved and protected areas. And when we say conservation, it generally means we're excluded from that, right? Like we're excluding people in general from those areas when there's not a recognition that that is our traditional territory, that we're connected to those lands. So when we have Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada, where is those decision-making powers lie? Where is the enforcement in that? We have Indigenous guardians in Canada as well, and there's no enforcement for Indigenous guardians. So we're seen as these caretakers, as these protectors of the environment without the actual enforcement behind that too. And I think that's an important thing to understand when we talk about false solutions. So we can't just be invited to these tables. We need to make our own tables. And we need the resources to do that too, right? So we're often seen as these caretakers, and that we can do these things for free because it's in our inherent duty. Absolutely, it's in our inherent duty, but we need the resources to make this actualized beyond our own communities. And something else that I had noticed with the false solution conversation too is that the status quo, as Robbie had talked about, and it's pushing economies as more important than human health and our human relationship to this land. And we see that touted in solutions like nature-based solutions. It is wanting to continue the status quo of producing oil and gas, of net zero, which I always tell my daughter, like, you didn't clean up your room if you're shoving all your toys in the closet and under the bed. That's not clean, right? So I think like that's something that we often forget about how do we tackle false solutions? We tackle those false solutions by addressing the systemic racism, the colonial systems, and the imbalance of power. And how do we relinquish that control to Indigenous communities that have the solutions within their territories, within their language, within their relationship to the land? So just wanted to add that. Totally on board with it. I'm just sitting here nodding.
Thank you, Rebecca. Edna, I see your hand up. Please turn your video on and join us.
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with the sentiments shared by Crystal, Rebecca, and Robbie. And I think for Indigenous people, nature-based solution is really what Indigenous people are already implementing. But I think the challenge we have is that the nature-based solution, the controversy comes from the fact that it's really loosely defined. So it's allowed to mean different things to different people. So we have seen that corporations are also promoting solutions like for climate change adaptation, like geoengineering, using patented genes and so forth. And also measures that they have highlighted, like protected areas and plantations, which impact Indigenous people through displacement, of course, restricting livelihoods, as Maya has said, and also that impacts the culture and practice of people. And I think we've seen the definition of these solutions, even for NB nature-based solution, is driven by corporates and also big conservation organizations. But Indigenous people are not having that space because of the political power play within the climate policy space. And I think the other aspect is that allowing it to be loosely defined. So there is inclusion of actions that offset emissions. So if a company or a private sector or government is mining or developing infrastructure in one place, they're allowed to offset by investing in another area, by restoring or modifying ecosystem, and that doesn't help. So it's the same kind of play. So you're destroying nature, and then on the other hand, you're supporting by providing the solution. So it's kind of not allowing people, and I agree with the fact with the speaker that has said we need to create our own tables, and I think we need really to change the table and showcase more what solutions we have as Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna. Olekanga, you had your hand up in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there are a number of ways to look into the issue about false solution. One way is actually, and I will, is a whole issue about power relations, power imbalance. A good example I will give is for instance Lake Turkana wind power, which is being profiled so much as of course, it's the largest wind farm in Africa. It's based in Kenya, and it is based on investment, a consortia from a number of European countries, Finland, Denmark, where they are putting an investment on this. And you realize that in terms of the independent power purchase agreements between this consortia of wealthy corporations from Europe, you realize that it's based on a certain very interesting policy whereby they sell power that has, you sign an agreement to sell power to the Kenyan authorities on a certain price that does not really depend on, so take it or leave it. So like you buy a soda bottle in a hotel, open it, and then whether you drink it or not, you still have to pay it. So you realize that that end up pushing the taxation of the Kenyan population. And then the same population end up actually affecting the environment. For instance, you produce those people, you have been displaced, they are poor, they end up burning charcoal, cutting trees to earn a livelihood. There are certain concealed efforts, certain concealed ways that the same people who are destroying the environment appear as saints in terms of promoting climate solutions. That's one. The other thing also, which is I would like to, is assuming that a pipeline with a leak will efficiently deliver the water to the most needy. This, and I like using graphical ontologies to tell stories. What I mean by this is everybody is talking about the money through everybody is talking about the money, pushing money through certain systems that and assuming that that money will reach those people, for instance, indigenous people who everybody agrees that have got a solution to climate. But the money, for instance, 1 billion Kenya shillings come through all these channels to the extent that what arrives at the indigenous people is so little administrative issues. So we talk so much about indigenous peoples having the right solutions, but there's very limited mechanism of those finances actually for action, reaching those people most in need to tackle those solutions. So we are talking so much, we don't want there's no courage to disrupt the systems that we know, the systems that are wasteful, the system that do not guarantee justice for the same people who need the solutions. So I think there are a number of ways to look at this, and I also of course you look at it in a different way also in terms of what solution. In terms of corporate taking lead or assumed lead in terms of solutions. You realize the same people giving certain countries money to invest in clean energy are the same countries where the money for oil exploration is coming from. So it's more or less, it's very interesting how you could look at this. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ole Kanga. Before we move on to our third and last question, Roby, please have the last word.
Yeah, just to quickly add, on the past solutions, what Ole Kaunga mentioned on the financing, the recent commitment from the COP to support indigenous peoples is quite welcome, but we know at the end of the day that these big funds that are being provided to support indigenous peoples will not really directly go to indigenous peoples, but will go to governments, will go to these big conservation groups who don't give the space for indigenous peoples to be able to implement their own programs and projects to protect the environment. So yes, financing is one needed to support climate change adaptation and other climate change initiatives, but how these finances are really directly supporting indigenous peoples is still a big question, because in terms of requirements and capacity and on, it's not something that indigenous peoples are able to meet up. So yes, financing is one issue that needs to be discussed in these false climate solutions.
Thank you, Ruby. Why don't we move on to our third question? We've started to slowly unravel this thread about power, and I want to stick with that as we turn to our third question. Indigenous peoples have the right to their lands, their territories, and the resources, yet many of them are severely affected by climate change, and their voices are often excluded from decision-making spaces. How can the climate movement and philanthropy support and respect the role of traditional knowledge and build power with Indigenous communities? And for this question, could I invite Rebecca, Ole Kanga, and Nele Jilji to join us in the sharing circle? Naya if you want to turn your video on and join us.
Thank you, Hillary. Unfortunately, I can't turn my video on because my network connection isn't properly well here.
Okay.
So yeah.
Oh, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
My name's Lady Tipa, and I work with First Stories Indigenous NGO Forum in Tanzania. We work with communities of indigenous pastoralists and hunters and gatherers community here, and we deal with a lot of issues concerning the indigenous people. Based on our questions, I will just kick out with at least 5 points, and the rest also put up on the progress. Indigenous people, first of all, should be respected through the integration of the indigenous knowledge on the diverse issues of policies at all levels. In areas like Tanzania, it's even hard to put out these communities for them not even being recognized based on our constitution and even other policies within us. So this has brought a number of questions in even involving them to different negotiation or different decision making in putting out the issues of indigenous people in regards to the communities that we work with. But it's also, nevertheless, it's if we keep on having movements on issues of climate change to support and respect the roles of indigenous knowledge by promoting and respecting the indigenous people rights to land, forest, and ecosystem as whole, can make other people even understand and appreciate the communities of indigenous. For instance, in Tanzania now, most of the indigenous people are victims of the conservation, victims of protecting their land. They are victims of their own livelihood that have continued keeping these areas that today we admire them, today we take them as protected areas or national parks or areas for others to come and see the nature. We can even cite with the issue that is going on currently in Ngorongoro, where a massive number of the indigenous pastoralists are to be evicted from their ancestral land due to the more expansions of these areas for tourism and other conservation matters. But we call upon issues like this movement to recognize, well-informed, and even appreciate this livelihood of these communities in order to keep, because out of that, they're still victims of also the climate change. But we forget that they're passing through a number of effects of climate change. What we only recognize, we put part of our own needs before the understanding of this real situation that is going on to the communities of indigenous. That's why for government, we forget to understand that despite people being good conservers or good protectors of this environment, they're also facing other effects, like the issues of climate change that now we are seeing everyone is being affected. Moreover, we would like to continue advocating and support the indigenous people on their best practices on adaptation, effort that they do through the issues of climate change. Many speakers have spoken on issues of the indigenous knowledge, and even citing examples. And this is one of the things that we acknowledge is more generational to our communities. Everyone who spoke that we see that we have one identity of communalism, it's not individualism. And this has made the indigenous communities continuing having this thing running into their blood, we can say that formality, but it has kept us as people who still recognize that nature is part of us. So by understanding the way that the communities of indigenous are protecting this ecosystem, and even should be put in our advocacy and continue giving out more information, more research that make everyone understand instead of them being only victims and also be condemned due to their livelihood that they live on. So several speakers have just spoke about the issues of financial support. If there is a possibility of financial sources to support indigenous people to address the issues of climate change crisis. I will put also forward on this issue because we have been hearing a lot of fund being there for indigenous people, but everyone has mentioned how the bureaucracy has continued putting a problem for the indigenous people accessing this platform in order for them to continue working with their issues based on the issues of this crisis that we're facing. But in other areas, we find that despite this social problem, how they are being silenced and how they're being alienated out due to them not being recognized at all. And even the activists that are working out on continue fighting for the right of this community, being also enemies of others. And sometimes be protest that they are only doing that for their own benefit, but actually it's for the masses of the communities. But based on platform like this, indigenous community likely will be part of accessing this fund and also working directly from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, I think Nalea really touched on like the criminalization of Indigenous folks and the dangers to our life and welfare in the protection of, as the IPCC report and as many other places have said, 80% of the world's biodiversity. The protection of 80% of the world's biodiversity is not just the protection for our lands and territories, but for all human health and all human life. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to address here, is when we look to ways that we can support Indigenous folks in the work that we're doing, it's about not turning a blind eye to the criminalization of Indigenous land defenders. It's recognizing the racial injustices that people are facing, that the climate crisis is a social justice issue, recognizing equity versus equality and the liberation of people. It often reminds me of this cartoon that circulated around LinkedIn a while back of, I think I have it here, but it's this idea of like, what is equity and what is equality? And right now, our Indigenous folks are seeing a severe lack of resources. We're constantly living in deficits in issues on food, water, energy, infrastructure, education. So supporting the redistribution of financial resources, I think, is vital to that, right? So we hold solutions within our communities, within our territories, within our nations. And with the financial resources, we can expand that further. That benefits all human health and all human life. And I think that's really important thing to recognize. I placed the image that I was talking about in the chat, and it's this idea of what is equality and what is equity, and what does that liberation look like? And I remember when this cartoon first started circulating, and I thought to myself, well, they're outside of the fence. How is that equity if they're outside of the fence? And I think like that's a really good like thought-provoking thing that's simplified for us to understand. Like even my children can understand that there's an injustice here. And I want to point out too that Indigenous folks living in these deficits can offer solutions to the deficits we're soon to face in the climate crisis as a global nation. So like there are ways that we can look to supporting and amplifying youth. Indigenous folks have always kept our youth very close to heart and in mentorship. So I'll show up to meetings with my kids sometimes because I want them to experience that tacit knowledge. I want them to experience the generational knowledge that we hold dear through our languages and through our land. And not just that, but through how we speak to one another and how we care about one another. So those are just some points that I've had. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that cartoon. Olikanga, why don't you go ahead, and then Joshua, feel free to join us in the circle. I see you have your hand raised. Oh, you're muted, Olikanga.
Right. Thank you very much. I think, first of all, what can philanthropists do to ensure that traditional knowledge of Indigenous people as very fundamental in terms of addressing climate change? What can they do? I think, to me, first of all, I think it's supporting Indigenous people's movement, a culturally people-led movement. This is very important to build that power, to revitalize the power within the people. To me, we need to think about movement, people-led movements that are culturally appropriate and that are tied to the identity of the people. And for you to do that, you must secure their territories and land, because that's where the power comes from. When you disconnect people from their territories or their land, then you disempower them. You take away their voice, you take away their resources, you disrupt their own livelihood. You culturally disrupt that people in terms of, and and that's was exactly what colonialism did, disempowering people by disrupting and creating a disconnect between people and their land. The other thing which can be done is actually, when you have restored the land, when you empowered people to right to land, right to identity, and then I think what you need to support Indigenous people to revitalize their own systems of self-organizing, to promote their own self-determined development. What I mean here is development that is culturally linked or embedded to their identity, their land, and their own collectivity as a people. I think those are some of the things that can be done. I think also it's very important to think through for our people who continue to face threats of being evicted from their territories or being displaced from their territories. What can be done? I think, to me, I think that first of all is actually enabling those people to fight for themselves, to regain their voice, and also to leverage through alliances building, to leverage their knowledge, to leverage their power with others who are like-minded or who have goodwill. They need to have, and also to promote indigenous learning circles. You just learned here that some of the traditional knowledge practices that are in Africa are also in Fiji and also part of the world. So supporting solidarity of indigenous people to indigenous people learning circles where they can build their voice globally is very important. And also what I think we need to think about also as philanthropists. Also, I think there are certain things that need to be done in terms of empowering people. Certain strategies of funding, or in fact, I hate this word funding because it's as if indigenous people are not bringing anything. It's an investment. It's a partnership that respects indigenous people's ways of life. I think that issue, without trust, we need partnerships that are based on mutual trust. That allows people to be themselves. Certain philanthropies actually are mechanism of making people drift away from being themselves. So for me, I think indigenous people need to evolve their own struggles, based on their own values, based on their own identities, and based on their own the relationship with their own territory and land. I think to me these are very important areas. If we can, if the world really want to benefit from indigenous people's traditional knowledge, these are some of the things that can be done in respect. But also, I think there are a lot of things in terms of policy at different levels that are really that recognizing indigenous people, because we are indigenous people continue to be the invisible, to be invisible in policy, in data. So also generating those data and also ascribing value to them. You know, traditional knowledge is being treated as something else apart from. I always give this story that, for instance, in Kenya, the government really likes communities, for instance, like the Maasai, as a part of promoting tourism. So they like the identity as a way of of brand, but they don't necessarily really care what happens to them. So these are some of the things that we need to really unpack when it is when this word philanthropy. We need to empower, to rejuvenate, revitalize indigenous peoples in terms of enabling them to be self-determined, people who are self-determined, people who have courage, people who have the abilities. And of course, all around, I think also capacity development in other areas where so they can be able to articulate and reinforce arguments that really advances their interests. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ole Kanga. Joshua.
Thanks so much, Hilary, and Bulavinaka, everyone. My name is Joshua, and I'm an indigenous Fijian joining from Fiji, along with my colleague Langi. I really just wanted to jump on very quickly and briefly add on to some of the amazing points that Ole and Rebecca had made. Firstly, I apologize for how I look like right now. It's going into 5:30 a.m. over here, and I haven't slept yet. So don't look my best, and my brain's a little bit fuzzy. But one of the things that I think that we as CSOs and philanthropic movements, however we choose to identify ourselves, can really do to add value to this space and to the idea of indigenous people within the sphere of climate change is to really start first by decolonizing that narrative that exists about us when you talk about our relationship with climate change. And I say that because first of all, I think that it's so incredibly important to constantly recognize and reinforce through our campaigning work and our influencing work and all the other work that we do, that we as indigenous people have always been and continue to be at the front line of the climate crisis. But at the same time, I feel like the narrative around us is almost always so concentrated around us as being just that, as being the people who are at the front lines of the climate crisis and who are most disproportionately affected by it. And then it just ends there. And I think that needs some decolonizing, because while that is true, while we are disproportionately affected by it, that narrative isn't the complete truth, right? We know from the conversations that we've had prior to this and the wonderful speakers that have spoken, that we've got so much, this immense wealth of traditional knowledge and practices that have been passed down for generations. And we know that that knowledge and those practices, that they can really act as the driver for this transition that we want to make into a greener, climate just, gender just future. And so that's one of the areas that I think that we can really add value to as civil society organizations. It's just to begin by decolonizing that narrative and putting ourselves forward and saying, you know, we're not just the poor people who are constantly having to battle climate change and the losses and damages that are associated with it. We're also the people that can provide the rest of the world with some really innovative, cutting edge solutions to this same climate crisis that confronts us today. And I think that's a really powerful way of putting ourselves forward and changing that narrative that can sometimes really hold us back and make us seem less than what we are. And I say that as an Indigenous Pacific Islander, because I think, quite frankly, I'm tired of this narrative that's always framing us as always being poor and dependent on aid and all this other sorts of toxic framings that we are subjected to. And it really stems from this idea that wealth can only be material. But we know that that's not true, right? We know that the wealth, particularly the wealth that we value, transcends the idea of the material. Even the things that are material, those are some pretty innovative areas. But for us, wealth can even go into the knowledge that we possess around farming practices, when to farm, when to plant certain trees, when to harvest, when to do all of these different things. That's all of that collectively, we view that as part of our wealth. And so this idea that we are poor and that we're always reliant on assistance from the global north, that's one that's based on their ideas of what poverty is, what defines poverty and what defines wealth. And something that I think spaces like this can do to help Indigenous groups and Indigenous people is to really say that's actually not true. That narrative is a narrative that you've given about us, but we have our own narrative, and that narrative we would like to put forward because it's one that really empowers us and it paints a far more accurate picture of what we have to offer the rest of the world, because everyone is going to face the harsh, incredibly harsh impacts of this climate crisis. And so that really is what I think that, and these spaces like this are exactly, I think, the starting point is just convening spaces, brokering relationships, being able to bridge Indigenous peoples with the state sector, even the multilateral spaces. Those are all really incredibly powerful and important starting points. Yeah, that's all from me. Thanks, Hillary.
Thank you, Joshua. This emphasis on narratives that center Indigenous peoples, not just as frontline responders, but as solution and knowledge holders is really important. Here's the one trying to speak. So if you want to join us, please turn your video on. It looks like it's Roby and Tanya. Go ahead and turn your videos on.
Oh, thank you so much, Hillary. I agree with Yeshua. Yeah, it's very important, this perspective. We have valid and valuable traditional knowledge, but we need to recover what is being lost with the new generation to guarantee the continuity of practice. Older people need to dialogue with young people. For that, they need to have a budget, logistical support. This is an issues that is not prioritized, but I think it's very important. Now, for example, in African region, the older people dialogue with young people, especially girls, about traditional knowledge. How is in the last and in the many years the traditional, for example, when I see the constellation, yes, but it's very important. Joshua say for work. Thank you.
Roby?
Yeah, it's the point that Joshua said, no, on stop looking at indigenous peoples as vulnerable sectors, but as rights holders and players in relation to the achievement of sustainable development. Now, it's already pointed out by many other speakers in relation to the importance of direct support for indigenous movements, support for the security of land tenure of indigenous peoples is very important, and also support for intergenerational transfer of knowledge to ensure the continuity of the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. But also we see that there is a weakening of the traditional governance of indigenous peoples, which is important in the defense and in the how do you call that, in the defense of indigenous peoples of their lands and territories. And I think that's also one aspect that needs to be looked at on the strengthening of traditional governance systems of indigenous peoples and the continuous building of second liners in indigenous movements and indigenous communities, because this is a big challenge that many indigenous communities are facing globally. No, we're losing out second liners, not only ones that will lead our communities, but also to engage in spaces like this to be able to voice out indigenous perspectives. The other aspect in relation to support is also the interface between technology and traditional knowledge. There's a lot of technology available out there that could enhance the traditional knowledge systems of indigenous peoples, but these are not being made available, no, to indigenous communities, like, for example, in relation to renewable energy, the technology that could harness water resource or wind resource in indigenous communities. Community-led initiatives are not very much supported, but rather in relation to renewable energy, they're more relying on these renewable energy companies to implement these projects. But if there's more support for community-led initiatives where it interfaces modern technology and traditional knowledge, then that could be more beneficial, not only to the community, but also for the continuity, no, of the forest and the environment. And lastly, I would second also the support for the for indigenous human rights, people's human rights defenders, but support for communities in struggle, support for communities under threat. Because as indigenous peoples strengthen their assertion for their collective rights, there's also this response from governments and corporates to commit a lot of violations against indigenous communities. So that kind of support is very much needed by not only individuals, but also the communities who are continuously struggling on the ground to protect their lands and territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. I see Gabriel has raised his hand.
Hi, everyone.
Hi there. Welcome.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Bueno, en este momento Oli nos va a ayudar a traducir. Mi nombre es Gabriel Cabrera, estamos acá desde Venezuela, en América Latina, y bueno, estamos trabajando junto a la Red de Acción por el Desarrollo Sostenible sobre la situación de los pueblos indígenas acá en la Amazonía venezolana y en la zona de La Guajira, que es una zona entre Colombia y en Venezuela, donde estuvimos documentando parte de nuestro trabajo de justicia social y pueblos indígenas.
Clara, could you jump in then?
Yes, I'm going to help and translate a bit for Gabriel. Gabriel is working from Venezuela. They have been working with us with Action for Sustainable Development on the situation of indigenous people in La Guajira, which is between Venezuela and Colombia.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you, guys. Yes, hablando un poco de la situación de los pueblos indígenas y las soluciones falsas que se han tratado de implementar en el país, nosotros queremos decir que, pues bueno, en la Amazonía venezolana ha sido, pues bueno, una situación de bastante precariedad, porque se ha propuesto por parte del gobierno nacional una idea de minería ecológica. La minería es el principal problema que afecta a las poblaciones indígenas, y esta minería ecológica, pues bueno, no tiene nada de ecológico, sino al contrario, ha traído muchos problemas a las poblaciones indígenas que vamos a explicar a continuación.
You're muted, Clara.
In terms of all solutions that have been offered to indigenous folks in the Venezuelan Amazon, Gabriel said this is a very precarious situation. The government has suggested a program for ecological mining, but it's very harmful for the population.
Yes. El principal problema, que es la minería en la Amazonía venezolana, es una minería que se hace de forma ilegal, donde empresas extranjeras, tanto de Rusia, Irán, Turquía y Canadá, están explotando oro y coltán en territorios que, según las leyes venezolanas, la ley penal de ambiente en Venezuela, que tenemos desde hace 30 años, pues bueno, dice que estos territorios deben ser protegidos por las poblaciones indígenas. En este momento, el gobierno, el denominado programa de minería ecológica, lo que está haciendo es tratar de involucrar a las poblaciones indígenas dentro del negocio de la minería ilegal. Y pues bueno, esta situación lo que ha hecho es involucrar a las poblaciones indígenas y perturbar los territorios en medio de lo que nosotros consideramos un conflicto armado, ya que se han desarrollado grupos armados irregulares que están encargados de la mafia, de grupos criminales alrededor de la minería ilegal, que han desplazado a estas poblaciones indígenas hacia Guyana y Brasil.
So mining is currently illegal in the Venezuelan Amazon. The law in the country says that indigenous people must protect the land, but there are foreign enterprises, businesses from Russia, Turkey, Iran, Canada, for example, mining for gold and coltan in the areas. And the ecological mining that has been suggested, what this does is it tries to involve indigenous people in these operations, but it ends up exploiting people. These mining operations have also led to the appearance of criminal groups and guerrilla groups that are generating an armed conflict, basically, in the area to protect mining activities.
Para contrarrestar esta situación, nosotros estamos promoviendo una campaña que, bueno, queremos hablarles a todos ustedes, que se llama Save the Venezuelan Amazon, Salvemos el Amazonas venezolano, donde queremos incluir a organizaciones de derechos humanos y organismos internacionales en promover que las poblaciones indígenas sean las encargadas de proteger el territorio de toda esta zona de la Amazonía venezolana, que representa 12% del territorio de Venezuela. Para nosotros es muy importante promover esta campaña, porque poco hemos hablado de Venezuela, de nuestro país, como un país amazónico, y Venezuela también forma parte de la Amazonía junto a Brasil, Colombia, Ecuador, y también parte de Perú y Bolivia, y queremos promover esta campaña para que sean respetadas las leyes venezolanas, que ya, según la Constitución de Venezuela, dicen que estos territorios deben ser protegidos y reglamentados por las poblaciones indígenas. Evidentemente, esto no se está respetando, se está irrespetando además los conocimientos tradicionales de las poblaciones indígenas, y nosotros queremos que desde esta campaña, Salvemos el Amazonas venezolano, podamos promover la forma de agricultura que tienen las poblaciones indígenas para proteger estas zonas, que además son zonas protegidas por la UNESCO. Canaima National Park, el Parque Nacional Canaima, que es una lengua indígena, es una zona protegida como patrimonio de la humanidad. Entonces, esto es parte de lo que nosotros queremos hacer, y queremos además que nos ayuden otros activistas climáticos y defensores de derechos humanos en el mundo a promover esta campaña acá en Venezuela, porque bueno, no solamente es algo que afecta al país, sino es algo que afecta a toda la región amazónica, incluyendo Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana y por supuesto también Ecuador.
Got it. So then Gabriel and his team would like you to know that they're helping with a campaign that they've created to address this issue. The campaign is called Save the Venezuelan Amazon, and their goal is so that Indigenous people truly hold and protect this territory, which is 12% of the entire territory of Venezuela. The Amazon is a multi-country forest, and laws in many of these countries, in principle, do protect these areas and say that Indigenous people are those who care for them and that live in there, but the laws are not being enforced at all. That is the actual problem. And the campaign is focusing on the protection of these Indigenous folks, and especially their languages and the different Indigenous practices. They are looking for other activists to collaborate for this campaign, especially those living in Amazonian countries. So they are open to collaboration on anybody who has to contact them.
Bien, para finalizar, queríamos, pues bueno, decirles que no solamente esta situación se ve afectada por la minería, sino que además de eso, en Venezuela, en la región amazónica y en la región de La Guajira, tenemos una grave crisis de salud pública de las poblaciones indígenas. Hay niños de la población indígena Guarao, que es una población que está en la frontera con Guyana, que están muriendo por malaria y enfermedades como el VIH y no hay ningún tipo de atención a la salud. Y hacia allí nosotros queremos dirigir la atención porque nosotros consideramos, pues bueno, que no solamente el desplazamiento por la situación minera, sino la situación de salud representa una grave crisis de nuestras poblaciones indígenas que hoy están en peligro en Venezuela. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Yeah, so in the Guajira region where they're working right now, the mining crisis is adding on to an ongoing health crisis. Kids are dying from malaria and HIV, for example, and their campaign is also focusing on these health reasons, health issues, and how climate intersects with them. That's all, and he thanks everyone for listening. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Gabrielle and Clara. If I could have all the speakers turn their videos back on, we'd love to get a screenshot with everyone whose voices were in the room today. And while we're doing so, I had planned to sum up the main points from the call, but in the interest of time, we'll not be able to do that, but please be on the lookout. We will have a blog that summarizes the main points and takeaways from this call, and you'll see that on our website in the next couple of, in probably a week or two. For the CGRF learning program, the 2021 was really our first year piloting the program. If you are a CGRF partner, please be on the lookout for a learning program survey that will be in your inboxes in the next day or two. We would love your insights on the webinars you attended in 2021 and how we can better offer engagement opportunities that best serve our partner community. This was the last of our identity-focused webinar series. Coming up next, we're going to be launching either monthly or every other month, depending on interest, partner sessions where one partner takes an hour. It's kind of like a brown bag lunch. One partner takes an hour and presents their project to any other partners in the community that would like to join. So please be on the lookout for sign-up opportunities for that. Those will not just be open to the CGRF community, but partners who are presenting would be welcome to invite other funders, other nonprofits, and whoever they would like to get their projects in front of. I think that's it for this call. Thank you very much for your time. I hope, Kelsey, did you get a screenshot? Because we'd love to have everyone. Maybe Maya and Tanya could also turn their videos and join us so we can get a screenshot of everyone. Perfect. Okay, everyone say cheese. Awesome. Thank you everyone for your time today, and we will be in touch. Have a great rest of your day, or good night to those who are going to bed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.